Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Sagla Saibone Ahlan wa Sahlan KH. This is the first breakout session of our program, and I have the pleasure of introducing this talk. Thanks to Dr. Alifia Ben, who actually did all the work. And what I'm good about doing is letting other people do the work and then taking all the credit. That's why I'm a surgeon. So, अपने जब सिलसिला में जे अपने जिक्र फरमावी करी रहा है कि मौलाना ना ये जे नेरोबी मना अशरा मुबारक में कलिमात फरमाया अने मौलाना अली ना कलिमात ना ऊपर जे टॉपिक्स छे इन्हें we've tried to gear each and every topic toward these कलिमात. तो आ talk के जे unleash your potential, insight into the memory, learning, and the power of Hifz al-Quran. तो अमीर मोमिनीन फरमावे छे कि तलब तो खैरत दारैन फलम अजिद हो इल्ला फी हादिहिल कलिमात. यानी कि अमीर मोमिनीन सु फरमावे छे कि मैं दीन अने दुनियानी खैर ने तलब करतो तो मगर मैं इन्हें परामू नहीं. I did not find it. मैंने परामू नहीं मगर आ तमाम कलिमात. So this was the नौमी तारीख जे आशुराना दिन जे मौलाए जिक्र फरमावी, this kalimat was on that day. So it was the collection of all the kalimat that came before it, all the other talab to na je jitna bhi bayanat che, this is the collection of it so the English translation is, I sought all the good in this world and the next, yani deen and dunya, and I could not find it except in these words. Yani aaj jitna bhi kalimat. It fits perfect in this talk के कुरान मजीद तो तमाम इल्म नी इना अंदर जामे छे अने इना अंदर इमाम हुसैन नी जिक्र मना अंदर तमाम इल्म समाय हुआ छे. So those two things combined is what we're about to talk, and इनी जे कुवत छे. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce our speakers. So today first Dr. Aliasger by Saherwala, Dr. Kaizar by Asif, and Hamza by Raja. So Dr. Aliasger Bhai was raised in Texas. Woohoo! He graduated with honors from UT Southwestern Medical School, which is also my alma mater. And he then completed a residency in neurology from UT Southwestern as well. I have seen Aliasger Bhai grown up since he was a child in madrasa, and it's very humbling to see him where he is today. He then went on to complete his fellowship in vascular, stroke, and neurology at Thomas Jefferson Medical School. And he is now, inshallah, moving back to Dallas to work as a vascular neurologist and neurohospitalist. Dr. Kedar by Asif, raised in Saherwala, India. He did his internal medicine residency in India in 2006. He then completed his neurology residency at MCW, which is in Milwaukee, and completed that in 2012. He then went on to complete a vascular neuro fellowship in 2013 and a neuroendovascular and neurocritical care fellowship in Milwaukee in 2015. If that wasn't enough, he continued on to do medical directorship of stroke and neuroendovascular at Ascension, Illinois, and he's currently in that position now. And he's a clinical assistant professor in neurosurgery at the University of Illinois in Chicago. Then we have Apna Hamza Bhai Raja, who was raised in Houston, and he attended Nisab Mahadu Zara in Houston from 1434 to 1437. And in that Nisab, he became Hafiz al-Quran, and he completed that task in 3 years. He spent the next 3 years helping his wife become Hafiz, which I know because I heard her cries all the time when she was frustrated. And he attended honors college at University of Houston and graduated with a BS in biology. And currently he is starting his 3rd year at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston, Texas. And we would like to invite the speakers to start their talk.
Can everyone hear me? Yes. Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So our talk is divided into three sections. We have three speakers, three sections. And so the first portion of this talk will be given by myself. I'm going to talk about the neuroscientific principles, the neuroanatomy of memory. Then we're going to have a section about linking that with Hifz al-Quran and seeing what evidence, what data there is between memory and Quran. And then we're going to finally sum it up with a practical application session of Hifz al-Quran using the techniques in memory that we have discussed. So, just my disclaimer, I'm not Hafiz al-Quran, but I've been a Niyat of Hifz. I'm not a cognitive neuroscientist, so technical questions, I will basically defer them. And then finally, this does not represent, this represents my view, not any official view, and then the Kedar. So, again, we wanted to start with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And when I just did that, all of you did taslim, right? So, do you remember why you did that? And we all do it subconsciously, right? We see it and we do it, right? Sometimes we see other people and we remember to do it, but there is a key point in our brain that we use just by doing that. And with that, I'm going to talk about a case I saw. There was an 86-year-old woman. She was in the hospital. She was Bengali. She spoke only Bengali. I don't speak Bengali. And so I saw her as a consult. 86-year-old woman, had a past medical history of atrial fibrillation, and she was demented. She had dementia. And so I was called to see her for the usual neurology consult, altered mental status, confusion. And then, they told me, oh, by the way, she's also weak on one side. I'm like, okay, she probably has a stroke. So I go in, lo and behold, the MRI shows she has a large left MCA stroke. Again, not a surprise, she has atrial fibrillation, she has a stroke, no big surprise there. So I go in to see her, and then the nurse is telling me, oh, she doesn't make any sense, I don't know what she's saying, the family is not here because it was COVID and we had no family members. And so I'm like, okay, fine, I'm going to go in and do my thing and I'll be out. So I go in, and I see this woman, she has no teeth, she is 86 years old, looks old, and I go in, I ask her name, she doesn't say anything, but the only thing she's saying to me, she doesn't follow any commands, doesn't say anything to me, all she says is she repeats, Allahu Samad, Allahu Samad, Allahu Samad. And so, to me, obviously, most of us understand and know what's going on, but in this hospital and in this system, no one knows what's going on. And so the nurses are worried, saying, is she aphasic, is she having some issues? And so I just stand there and just watch her. She's very confused. She's just saying, Allahu Samad, Allahu Samad. And so I just, start by saying, Qul huwallahu ahad. And then she continues, Qul huwallahu ahad, Allahu Samad. And she finishes the whole surah, and then she's finally calm and she actually stays quiet, right? So despite her being demented, despite her having a large stroke, there is some inner essence of Quran that's retained in there. And that's very inspirational. And so that also, leads me to the fact that, we don't know much about memory. There's a lot of scientific issues, scientific principles that we can talk about, but in the end, there's a lot we don't know. And that's where Quran comes into play. And so going into that, I'm going to talk and start by the overall, the context of my talk. I'm going to briefly touch about the Fatimid philosophy of memory, and then go into the neuroscientific principles. I have no expectation you will retain anything, right? There's a lot of data, a lot of information, right? You can always Google all these things, right? So your take-home message should be just to understand that there's a lot to do with memory, and it is everyone's individual basis on how we use our own capabilities and using these principles into application. And so, Shir Hussain Bayasif, in his kitab, actually talks about memory. And in this, he brings into ayat in the Quran, he talks about وَالذِّكْرُ فَإِنَّ الذِّكْرَ تَنْفَعُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ and سُنُقْرِئُكَ فَلَا تَنْسَى. So there's many, many ayat in the Quran that talk about specifically memory and yad. And specifically in Fatimid philosophy, I'm not going to go into this, but we know that, different A'immat have discussed in their kitab about different kinds of memory. And specifically, we talk about, mercuric memory, Zakaratul Zahabiyya, golden memory, Tayyara, vapor, Zakatul Waqtiyya, temporary present, Kasiratul Mudda, and Tawilul Mudda, long and short-term memory. So again, this concept is not new. It's been there for thousands of years, but now we're trying to translate these principles into neuroscientific principles. And so how do we do that? Is by basically dividing memory into three different parts. We have working memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. So working memory is basically memory that's briefly in our conscious for maybe a few seconds. That's the memory that stops us from putting in namak twice in the tartari. That's the memory that we use very, very quickly. We don't retain it. And we have short-term memory that's less than 15 seconds. This is when someone tells you a phone number and you remember it, right? And the only way we can incorporate the short-term memory into long-term memory is by doing different tricks and different processes. Hamza will also talk to us about those things. And long-term memory can be explicit or implicit, conscious or unconscious. And these are, events, facts, different things that we have to remember how to do or to say. And so memory, we can divide overall into long-term memory, divided into explicit or implicit. Explicit memory, as we talked about, is facts and events. Implicit memory is subconscious and unconscious memory. These involve skills and habits priming, which we'll talk about, and then different habits and associations involving emotional and muscle movement responses as well. And so based on this division, right, we want to talk about neuroanatomy, because we're physicians, we want to know kind of the scientific basis for all this. And so the way we do this and have decided to figure out what's going on is there are different tools we can use for imaging, functional MRIs, where people do a task and the brain is visualized. We have abnormal PET scans as well. And we also have different animal models people have used where they create a lesion in the brain and see what happens with the animal. And finally, we have a natural way with strokes and diseases that affect the memory. And so we have an idea kind of where the memory is visually affected in the brain. And then finally, there's also a neurochemical aspect where we have different neurotransmitters. This is much more active. This is not a location. This is all around the brain. And you have a more dynamic process in play. And so based on these two things, we can kind of figure out roughly which areas of the brain are associated with different areas of memory. So you have the medial temporal lobe involved, you have the basal ganglia, the neocortex, the amygdala, cerebellum, and the reflex pathways. Now, this is located in different areas of the brain. Right? The amygdala, we also have heard about, is involved in emotion and fear. Hippocampus is involved in memory. The neocortex on top, right? The prefrontal cortex are all involved in higher order thinking as well. But the more important thing I want to know is that, yes, we have these locations, but they're not static. In fact, let's go back one. In fact, there's actually a process called a connectome, and we're finding out more information about this. And memory isn't just in one area specifically, but there's a network all around the brain that we're developing. So if you have a small lesion or a small hit in one area, that can affect other areas, not just in that one typical area that we see. And so this is an area of research that's growing as well. And it's dynamic. It allows for us to be more plastic in knowledge and memory and how it changes. And so based on that, there are cognitive neurology specialties that look at all these processes, and then we make diagnoses. It's not just neurologists who make these diagnoses, but a host of other practitioners, psychiatrists, therapists, psychologists. All these people help in making these diagnoses when memory is affected. We look at the different etiologies, processes, and the diagnoses using different clinical skills like an exam, lab work, and imaging. And so I just want to give one example of one disease that I think all of you guys have heard about. This is Alzheimer's disease. It's very, it's more prominent, and is now something that's actually a medical burden, and it's growing. It's a form of dementia, dementia meaning just problems with memory that involve functioning. So their memory is affected to the point where they can't do some certain tasks. And so based on that, the pathophysiology is that the lesions in the brain caused by neurofibrillary tau proteins and amyloid plaques, initially in one area that spread to the brain. This is, impairment in short and then long-term memory. But most importantly, there's also an association with emotion as well. And so these patients can have psychiatric conditions as well. And you'll see this as a repeating theme. Memory and emotion are always linked, right? You can't separate the two. Memory and the senses are always linked. And so by using these other forms of associations, we can kind of figure out what other processes can be encountered in patients who have these diseases. So diagnosis, we do a history, we do a neuropsych exam. There are different imaging studies, there are CSF studies that we can do as well. But again, the main point I'm going to bring home is that this is becoming an increasing burden. It's not only in the U.S. but everywhere. These patients are difficult to treat and to take care of. And so based on that, there are a host of other diseases that are neurodegenerative in nature, as well as Parkinson's, there's Alzheimer's, frontotemporal dementia. There are TBIs, brain injuries, there are vitamin deficiencies. There are strokes as well that can cause memory impairment. There are substance uses, psychiatric issues, and infections. All these things can cause memory impairment in some way. And so, again, the take-home point, just summarizing my section is, I'm sure everyone's heard this ayat in the Quran before, right? وَلَقَدْ يَسَّرْنَا الْقُرْآنَ لِلذِّكْرِ فَهَلْ مِن مُدَّكِرٍ, right? Quran, Hifz, Ihsan, Ahsan, Saherwala, right? We talked about the different forms of memory, how we have working, short-term, long-term memory. We talked about the different types of memory, as well as the anatomical and functional components. We briefly touched about dementia as well as Alzheimer's. And finally, this is a long-term process that memory, emotion are all interconnected as well. And then we'll take questions at the end. So because you can't remember these questions at the end, write them down.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. And Bismillah. Shukran, the organizers, Alifia bin and Mufadabrai and Mubarak for this fantastic conference. The last thing I want to do is to be a hurdle to Hamza Bhai's talk. So I want to be really short. But what I tried to do for this talk, and I mean, it goes without saying that intelligence and cognition overall is a way bigger concept than mere memory. Right? Memory is a component of it. But it is also true that memory and intelligence go hand in hand, which means that there is a certain kind of feedback loop, and there's considerable literature on it about memory and the correlation with intelligence, about the fact that the tighter you can make connections of new material into already existing web of information, the more you can learn. And the more you can learn, the more information you can process and understand the world better, which then helps you remember more. So there is a feedback loop to it, and everybody is aware of that. There is considerable amount of scientific literature on it. And we are not going to talk about it. The question, however, is, does Quran Hifz lead to higher level of intelligence? Okay, that's the question. So that's the question that I tried to pursue in the most objective manner, keeping my bias of being a movement aside and scientifically looking at it, just like how I would write a review paper, look at advanced search PubMed, look at papers that come about, and see what the quality of the papers is and what their conclusion is. So critically reviewing literature, just like how you would do when you, as a reviewer, a journal sends your paper, you look at the methodology, you look at everything in detail. So that's what I tried to do, and let's see. Sorry. Down. So, these are the terms. Quran Hifz and cognition, intelligence, what else is there? Attention, academic achievement, stress, well-being, and cortical enhancement, cortical structure. So cortical growth. So these are the terms that I used and looked at literature. Let's see what came up. Down. This is the paper. This is a paper from our madrasas in Karachi, 5 madrasas with 50 students, 10 teachers, and the design is a mixed methods design, which basically means that there are qualitative surveys that are then converted into using Likert scales into data and quantitative survey, which all of you are familiar with. And purposive sampling means that If you want to study people who play soccer, you ask them, do you play soccer? And they say yes. Do you include them? It's very simple. And what this is what it shows. How do I point? Yeah. So, you know, the question is, does the process of Hifz improve individual aptitude and cognitive performance? And strongly agree. So a large majority agree that it does. And this is students, right? So the 50 students are asked, and 25 men, 25 women. This is the question is teachers' responses to if students do not enjoy classroom learning of other subjects due to Hifz. So does it interfere with the interest in learning other things? And the answer of the teachers is 58% disagree, and strongly disagree 20%, right? And 6% agreed that yes, it does dissuade, okay? Then there is, does the coming up with new ideas, students' response. And you see that there is strongly agree and agree, so that's a large majority, and uncertain, 14, new ideas. How about teachers' response? Again, strongly agree, large. So a certain number are uncertain, which is 10%. How about enhances human memory and helps retain verbal and visual instructions? And that is strongly agree, 78%, uncertain, 12%. Mathematical problems. Again, same thing, 43% agree, and strongly agree is 34%. Same thing for teachers' responses as well, okay? This is another paper. Now, no real statistical analysis because the sample size is really small, but certainly a large majority of students and teachers agreed on the side of it enhancing various aspects of cognitive abilities. This paper, again, is looking at students in Rawalpindi and Peshawar, same purposive sampling, 36 Hifz, all less than 30 years, right? So these are adults that they are looking at, but less than 30 years. And two types of surveys. They looked at academic achievement and, interestingly, socio-cultural life. What is the impact on overall socio-cultural life, socio-cultural spiritual life? And Hifz and their parents were asked as well. So, you know, busy slide, but what it basically is saying is that with Hifz, they felt better, they were more content, and these are obviously all subjective questions, but these are asked in the form of surveys, and the total responses are 36. Things like, you know, contentment in life, trust upon God, obedience towards parents. So these kinds of, how did that impact from Hifz? The more, you know, this is a smaller study, but I included because it's in kindergarten kids. So they were asked to memorize a surah, and a surat in in Syria is the surat, but 10 students, small study, but kindergarten kids. And they were asked to memorize in a certain specific way of memorizing one ayat, and then only after you memorized it, going to the next one, and then memorizing two, and then going to the third one. So the way one does Hifz. And then they looked at intelligence tests. I've not shown it. It's a really small sample size, not a very well done study, but interesting. This is something which I thought was very well done with a larger sample size. In Malaysia, adolescents, the group that we, at least I as a parent of a to-be adolescent kid, is most interested in, right? And I think Hamza will answer that question in the most beautiful way, but you know, how does Hifzul Quran affect the academic performance of kids that are involved in and are going to pursue other academic activities? how does that? Does it take them away? Does it take the time away, and does it disturb it, or does it enhance it? Right. That's an important question. So they looked at 159 kids and divided them into 4 groups on the level of Hifz that they had done. So less than 1, 1 to 10, 10 to 20, and 20 to 30, right? So 4 groups, and they matched them for age, gender, sociocultural background, education status, etc. And then this is the baseline status. I just highlighted the ones that are important. And I think the fact that they objectively measured it. So it was not just a survey. They objectively looked at IQ using FSIQ, which I'm going to talk a little bit about in the next slide, quality of life, right, using SF36, and hormone levels, so cortisol for stress and serotonin for well-being, right? And this is what the FSIQ means. Basically, it looks at the ability to comprehend, process, and interpret textual material. PRI is process perceptual reasoning index, which is perceptual reasoning index, and VCI is vocabulary and similarity. So PRI looks at block design and matrix reasoning on how fast people can make sense of sensory data. And VCI is vocabulary and similarities. And the Quran memorizing experts had considerably greater, so statistically significant greater FSIQ compared to beginners, right? And this is the FSIQ and the VCI. And these are the cortisol and serotonin levels. Interesting, right? In comparison of beginners to experts. So, they have not explicitly mentioned it, but I'm assuming group 1 to group 4. Less than 1 Sipara to 10 to 30, 20 to 30 Sipara. And then this is an MRI study looking at voxel-based morphometry, and in Singapore, on 28 people, 1.5 Tesla MRI, and to measure cortical thickness. And sorry about that. They looked at areas orbitofrontal cortex, cingulate gyrus, and occipitotemporal gyrus, and they measured increase in cortical thickness. Again, very small, not a very well done study. Aziz Bhai just walked in and can beat me up on this MRI study. So, conclusions. There is a dearth of studies. There is no doubt about that. There is a dearth of studies specifically pertaining to Quran Hifz and cognition, but existing literature, quantitatively as well as qualitatively, does support a positive impact on intelligence, academic performance, and overall well-being. Better quality studies, inshallah, should happen and would happen. But the main thing is that I am convinced. All right. Shukran.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So Dr. Aliasger Bhai talked about the science of memory. Dr. Kaizar Bhai talked about cognition and Quran and how those two are linked together. We're going to talk about the practical application of actually doing Quran Hifz. Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam आका ये उम्मीद फरमानी चाहिए कि हर घर में कम से कम एक तो हो जाए Quran Hifz. Now हमारा मासी everyone has a need कि अपने Quran Hifz करिए. हमारे मासी घना लोगों करता है से सगलाना फर्जंद लोग करता है से. But now today we're going to learn about how can we apply science and medicine to make the process of Hifzing easier for us. So I brought these two quotes because they address a common sentiment behind doing Hifz. We all want to do Hifz, but we can also find every excuse in the world to not start right now. So I like these two quotes because Walt Disney says the way to get started is to quit talking and begin doing. Mark Twain says the secret of getting ahead is getting started. So in light of these quotes, we're going to get started. If we can close the doors, we have 15 minutes for everyone to Hifz this, and that'll be your way out. This was everyone's face. Because the truth is that when you see a big page of Quran, the first thing you feel is overwhelmed. There's a lot to learn, and you don't necessarily know where to begin. So the goal for today is to break it down into steps where we can look at a page of Quran and figure out where can we start right now. So let's make this easier. We saw that big page of Quran, and Dr. Aliasger talked about earlier that in order to make things into long-term memory, there's a sequence. There's first working memory, there's short-term memory, and then there's long-term memory. So we want to make our Quran Hifz, we want to encode it as our long-term memory. In order to do that, we need to first make it our short-term memory. Short-term memory allows you to remember 5 to 7 bits of information at a time. So in that page of Quran, technically the page is already split up into bits of information. There's ayats on the page. But depending on the surah, ayats can be very long, or they can also be very small. And remembering that, we need to find a more efficient way to break it down and make it easier for us to digest. That's where the concept of chunking comes in. In chunking, you split up big ayats into smaller, more manageable pieces, and bigger ayats and small ayats into bigger, more digestible pieces. So let's do that with the page that we saw. This is Surah Al-Takwir and Kismo Siparo. Gana logon ne Hifz hase, but I chose something that, maybe we can all apply for our Farzan Dua as well. This is the same page that I showed earlier, but split into two sections. If we just look at the top part, it looks much more easier for us to be able to actually sit down and memorize. So now we've broken it down, and we can kind of get over the feeling of overwhelmingness when we saw that big page. We see something that we know we can memorize. What's the next step? The next step is encoding. This is the process that we call jadid. Encoding is the process of storing incoming sensory information. It utilizes the senses. Aliasger talked about how your senses have a big impact on your memory, especially your emotion as well. Well, for Quran Hifz, the senses that we can practically use for doing Quran Hifz is sight, sound, and touch. And we're going to do this. The whole point is we're going to actually do this today, and hopefully when you guys leave, you will have Hifz a couple items. There's a lot of laughs, so I'm serious. Okay, so now let's actually encode this information. To do that, we want to first listen to, it's a very active process, by the way. We want to activate all our senses and really be engaged in the process of doing this. We're going to listen to an audio, audio. When you do that, listen to how he pronounces the word. Listen to what the rhythm of the different ayats are, how different words sound. Listen to its pronunciation. Visualize the words on the page, and don't just look at them. Visualize the actual words. Try to remember what the page layout is, because that's going to help you going forward. Where is this on the page? As the cycles increase, when we're listening to the audio, you can try to close your eyes and try to follow along in your head. Where is shelter without praying? And then touch. How can we utilize touch in doing jadid? As we're listening to the audio, count the ayats on your fingers. Additionally, Shah Hussain is going to pronounce things certain ways, and you're going to try to mimic. Try to remember where's your tongue touching in your mouth in different ayats. All these things will help us encode and do jadid easier. So let's try. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم Feel free to pray along. Feel free to.
إذا الشمس كورت وإذا النجوم انكدرت وإذا الجبال سيرت وإذا العشار عطلت وإذا الوحوش حشرت وإذا البحار سجرت وإذا النفوس زوجت بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إذا الشمس كورت وإذا النجوم انكدرت وإذا الجبال سيرت وإذا العشار عطلت وإذا الوحوش حشرت وإذا البحار سجرت وإذا النفوس زوجت.
Okay, now last time we'll do it one more time. This time, try to close your eyes and for as many words as you can, try to close your eyes and fill in the blank in your head. Try to close your eyes and visualize what the page looks like as Shelton was praying.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إذا الشمس كورت وإذا النجوم انكدرت وإذا الجبال سيرت وإذا العشار عطلت وإذا الوحوش حشرت وإذا البحار سجرت وإذا النفوس زوجت.
That was total of, I think, 1 minute and 10 seconds. Now, nobody actually hits all 7 ayats right there. But there's things we can do further to enhance our memorization and make it more efficient as well. One of those things is semantic encoding. We talk about encoding as just using our raw senses to try to memorize this information. Semantic encoding is attaching a meaning to whatever you're trying to memorize, and that strengthens the ability to memorize. For Quran, we can find the meanings for the ayats that we're doing hifz of in Khazain Ma'ani al-Quran. That is a Quran that Jamiatul Sayfiya has nashared, and most of us have it at home. It looks like this. It's the color-coded Quran. Now, when we say attach a meaning to the ayat, the goal is not necessarily to understand the entire meaning of the ayat while you're doing hifz. If you can, alhamdulillah, but that's a very complex process. The goal is for each ayat, attach a meaning to it that then you can refer to going forward. That, oh, I know this ayat has something to do with this. So let's do it practically. إِذَا الشَّمْسُ كُوِّرَتْ. In that first ayat, I don't know what kuwirat means, but I know shams means sun. So when I think إِذَا الشَّمْسُ كُوِّرَتْ, I can think sun. وَإِذَا النُّجُومُ انْكَدَرَتْ. Nujum means stars. So I know first thing is sun, now there's stars. وَإِذَا الْجِبَالُ سُيِّرَتْ. Jibal, paharo. So, I mean, there's a common theme here. Suraj, Chand, paharo. وَإِذَا الْعِشَارُ أُطِّلَتْ. I don't know what any of these words mean in وَإِذَا الْعِشَارُ أُطِّلَتْ. But I can refer to the Quran, and it says on the side here, Ishar wo untriyo ye je hamil hoy. Okay, untri, camel. So we have sun, stars, paharo, mountains, and camel. Next ayat, وَإِذَا الْوُحُوشُ حُشِرَتْ. Again, I don't know what any of these words mean, but it says wuhush, jungli janwar. All right, these are images that I can put into my head. Suraj, tarao, paharo, untri, and jungli janwar. وَإِذَا الْبِحَارُ سُجِّرَتْ. Bihar is daryo. وَإِذَا النُّفُوسُ nafs. Okay, we have a picture of all 7 ayats that we're trying to memorize. Now, we're going to listen to the audio again. We talked about using our senses. Now, as you're praying it, also try to visualize the image that you have in your head as well, and attach a meaning behind that.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إذا الشمس كورت وإذا النجوم انكدرت وإذا الجبال سيرت وإذا العشار عطلت وإذا الوحوش حشرت وإذا البحار سجرت وإذا النفوس زوجت.
Okay. So now we're repeating it again and we have a deeper understanding that at least allows us to hifz a little bit better, more efficiently. Now, most of the time, if you talk to anyone that's actually done Quran hifz, for every ayat they hifz, they're not going and finding the mana behind it. Because it's not, I mean, you don't need to do it. Sometimes raw encoding is enough. If you get good at it, someone who's done hifz, by the time they're tamaming their hifz, they can do a page in like 20 minutes. When you're starting off, that's when these techniques really come in handy. So we're not going to repeat it again, but that's the idea of semantic encoding. Now, is there further tips that we can use, different tricks that we can use, especially for our farzando, that can help them try to put all this a little bit easier to manage? Because even, I mean, if we take the semantic encoding, still, you have to remember sun, stars, mountain, camel, jungli janwar, ocean, soul. Like, I mean, that's, again, just raw information I'm trying to memorize. So on top of memorizing, I'm memorizing. Well, we can use mnemonics to make that process a little bit easier. Mnemonics are is a device such as a pattern of letters, ideas, or associations that assist in remembering something. Quran is filled with patterns. Be creative and do what works for you. Now, again, like I said earlier, this is not something you do every time. But if there's a page that you're having struggles with, then these are different tricks that you can do to make it easier. So let's go back to the example we're looking at. First, in إِذَا الشَّمْسُ كُوِّرَتْ, let's just look at a pattern. If you look at it, yeah, someone said it. Every single ayat in these 7 ayats starts with some form of إِذَا. Well, we can kind of keep track in our head. Okay, it's إِذَا, وَإِذَا, 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 وَإِذَا. So everything's وَإِذَا except for the first one, إِذَا. Okay, one thing to keep it. So now you know the starting of each ayat. You also know one word that's like an image that you associated with some meaning. Another thing, we made the meaning, but let's try to put it together so we can remember it easier. Well, we can try to make a story out of it, or we can try to do whatever we want with it, but I just thought of it earlier, and the easy thing is we can go from biggest to smallest. You could think sun, which is very big, stars, not the most astronomical correct, but we'll remember as smaller. Paharo, smaller than stars. Untri, smaller than pahar. Jungli janwar, for the sake of memorization, we'll think of monkey, smaller than camel. Ocean, just think of water, a drop of water. Smaller than jungli janwar. And soul, invisible. So now you remember the order of our semantic encoding as well. Suraj, tarao, paharo. Untri, jungli janwar, daryo, nuts. And so now we'll listen to it one last time.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إذا الشمس كورت وإذا النجوم انكدرت وإذا الجبال سيرت وإذا العشار عطلت وإذا الوحوش حشرت وإذا البحار سجرت وإذا النفوس زوجت.
So here we basically broke down something that seemed very overwhelming at first, broke it down into chunks, tried to understand those chunks, and try to find things that basically make the whole process overall seem smoother. So what happens when you finish this and you memorize these 7 ayats? You rinse and repeat. We did this with 7 ayats. It took maybe 10, 15 minutes. The goal is to show you that this isn't something, I mean, this is a room of physicians and, people are already strained for time as it is. Doing Quran hifz is not something that you need to take hours at a time and sit down and do it. The whole point is that you can do this 10, 15 minutes at a time, but the whole purpose is to start. We could keep going, but I know we don't want to keep going. So we spent all this time talking about Jadid, because that's really the hardest part to start off on. In starting, it's like you feel overwhelmed even learning something new. So that's why we spent that much time talking about it. But there's actually 3 components when you're doing Hifz. Jadid, which is learning new information. Juzhali, which is reviewing recently learned information. And Murajat, which is reviewing prior learned information. Now, Muraja and Juzhali, so first I want to also emphasize that those are very big importance of actually doing Quran and Hifz. 2/3 of the whole process is revision. 1/3 is the Jadid part of it. Now, Muraja and Juzhali also have a foundation, they're also grounded in science. The whole process, there's this graph here, the forgetting curve hypothesis. Basically, the whole hypothesis is that when you learn something initially, as time progresses, the retention of the memory is also going to decay. First, pretty steeply at first, but then eventually you're going to reach a baseline. As you recall the information, every subsequent time you're recalling it, not only one are you delaying the forgetting curve, but also you're increasing your baseline retention as well. Now the basis behind Juzhali. In Juzhali, this is recently learned information. Maybe things you learned, probably in the last like 7 to 10 days. You want to review this continuously because you want to solidify this in your memory, and you want that retention to be high, so that way even if you look at it later, it'll still be solid. Murajaat is things that already have reached that retention. This is stuff that, if I want 5 mosi paro and I know 30 mosi paro, you could ask me in a week, I'm still going to know 30 mosi paro. This is the power of spaced repetition. We don't need to do murajaat and everything we learn every day. It's not sustainable. By the time you reach 0 siparo, you're not going to have time to do 3 siparas. By the time you do 15 mo siparo, you're not going to have time to do 15 siparas murajaat every day. You want to be efficient with your time, and you want to be efficient with your energy as well. So you cycle murajaat because this is something you already have a high retention rate of. Cycle murajaat siparas, that way they come frequently enough that you can prime that forgetting curve again, and you're not forgetting it. Juzhali, you want it to come frequently until you're ready to pass it off into the murajaat state. Now I put this picture here because this is the Waqtul Huffaz Ziyafat in Surat that happened a couple years ago. And ultimately our goal is Maulani Khushi, our gharaz is Maulani Khushi. So आखिर में आपने हम दुआ करिए कि खुदा ताला अपने कुरान हिफ्ज करवाने कुव्वत अने यारिया पे अने आवता हुफ्फाज ज़ियाफ़त में हमारा नामों भी ये गिनती में शामिल है. खुदा ताला सय्यदना मुफद्दल तिफ़ुन आकानी उम्र शरी में तारोज़ क़यामत दराज़ दराज़.
Billah, I would like to, Subhanallah, MashaAllah, Alhamdulillah. Tanuj, better presentation. I would like to thank the presenters for bringing a very complex topic and merging it with a scientific background. And I'd like to pose 2 comments, and then we'll open it to questions. One, Hamza bhai, Dr. Kaizar bhai, and Aliasger bhai, that we had Maulana farmave che ke hifz karvu ganu sahel che, magar hifz rakhu ganu mushkil che. So you touched on that very well in terms of the memory aspect, but I'd like to pose one comment and sort of question is the repetition, japne murajat ke. So murajat nandar we repeat over and over and over, and there is some data that shows the myelin sheath that encodes the neurons, especially when you repeat firing of those particular neurons, you build up a very thick myelin sheath around that. So the concept of murajat comes from repetition, and then recall for those particular ayats becomes fast and very efficient. Has there been more data on that or studies in that regard?
Tons of data on memory in general and enhanced synapses and synaptic growth and so on, with techniques like elaboration, visual imagery of words, chunking, mnemonic coding, encoding, all of these being looked at. So you studies looking at one particular aspect or multiple of those, and looking at data on cortical thickness, synaptic connections, growth of areas in medial temporal lobe, hippocampus, on functional MRI studies. So there is data on that. As I said, my intent was to look at Quran Hifz, and unfortunately there is data that is lacking in that, but the principles still should apply and remain the same.
The last comment I would like to make, Hamza bhai, with what you presented today in terms of how you broke it down, I would challenge you in your youth and create a Quran that has this type of pictorial demonstrations and broken down into these fragments of Hifz, and Farzanda Waste, it becomes much easier. That would be a great achievement, and it would be a great yari to all the mothers in the room, because I know the trauma you go through when you're trying to get your kids to Hifz. So I challenge you and your colleagues. You know, I'm available to always help you. I can't commit a lot of time, but I will be always there to guide. But I challenge you to do that. I would like to open up for a few minutes of questions. I know this is a topic. I know Zainab Ben had one.
Thank you so much for this talk. I don't know if I'm the only one in this situation, but I, like Joshma, start doing Hifz and do a Siparo and, do all these things, but then fall off the horse, because of whatever event. And then it becomes very, hard to think about relearning all those things that I Hifz so that I can move forward. So do you have any advice for, if you've Hifz a little bit or a lot, multiple Siparos, how can you get back into the rhythm?
Yeah, it's definitely challenging. It's a problem everyone faces, because keeping consistency for that long while you finish the entire Quran is nearly impossible. There's always breaks, even if you just say, I went on a vacation for a week. A week is a long time for Quran Hifz. One key thing I would say is consistency as much as possible is key. Even if you're limiting yourself to, just doing, I don't have time to Jadid today, I'll at least review 3-4 pages of my Muraja. The other thing is, I'll address, many times we get Josh and we'll do, I'll give 5 pages this week and then there's 3 weeks where I did nothing. Better than that, I would say, try to be consistent in the small pieces. Limit your time to maybe doing, 2 ayats a day, 2 lines a day, but make sure you're consistent and keep your goal as consistency, not as progress ayat-wise. Because if you do that, you'll develop a habit of actually doing Quran, and that'll be a lot more beneficial than that sprint 5 pages you did on that one day.
So I'm a 4th-year medical student. I'm sure all medical students in the room know what Anki is, which is basically a flashcard system, essentially with the same principle. My question to you is, could you possibly Hifz using Anki?
Yeah, so it's actually really funny that you say that. I have a friend, so I don't know about Hifzing with Anki, because in Hifz, sequence is very important, right? And actually doing Jadid is very important that, this ayat comes before and after this ayat. So for actually doing Jadid with Anki, I don't, maybe possible, not the most efficient way, but I have a friend who does Murajat with Anki. And this is after he's Hafiz, but now in order to retain his Hifz, Anki is very time efficient. It looks at your intervals, it looks at, for those that don't know, Anki is a spaced interval flashcard system. Basically what it does is, it gives you a flashcard, and you say, how well do I know this fact? Is it easy, medium, or difficult? If you say easy, it'll give it to you in 2 days. If you say easy again, it'll give it to you in 4 days. It'll keep increasing the interval as long as you're saying, yeah, this is easy for me. Quran Hifz, when you're doing Muraja, it's the same concept. If Ismo Siparo is easy for you, you don't need to keep bringing it every 2 days. You can wait a week and do it again, because it's still going to be easy for you. So using Anki for that, I have a friend that does it. I should ask, maybe I can route you to him, but in theory, it's possible. But also, I would do it siparas at a time, not ayats at a time.
Thank you very much for that excellent talk. I would follow in Mustafa''s request to task you, Hamza bhai. Ape je, the Nuzul Masi je Farzando ne je Hifz kari ne nikle che, they accomplish a lot. And in my kind of research academic interest, we look at cognitive development in pediatrics. So if you can correlate and kind of compile the data, because so many people have accomplished so much after doing Hifz, and use a control group of similar mu'mineen, blind the test results of standardized tests, and show that there is no difference and improvement, I think it would add to some of the studies that Dr. Kaizar also kind of presented that are not necessarily peer-reviewed, but very objective. And clinical outcomes is what we kind of focus on as a solid product. It doesn't require bench work. It's just kind of random blinding numbers and looking forward. I think you will get a lot more buy-in in addition to Moana to Farmavichip and to the mind that is still thinking, I need objective data, that this is not going to limit my child's success. This is only going to help it. So I think, again, it's such an amazing accomplishment that Hifz karine tame medical school ma jao, tame doctor bano. It's, I think, would only encourage more people to join. So
yeah, I think it's a really good idea. And you said something about the limiting child success. That brought on a different thought in my head. Dr. Aliasger had talked about like the connection between emotion and doing memory, and something that our Janaba had stressed on us all time and time again, after we had finished doing Quran and we're listening to other kids, it's that when you're karawing hymns to kids, the emotional aspect is very important for their memorization. So I would say maybe for parents out there, make sure it's not too stressful and tiring and demanding for the child themselves, because ultimately you want them to have, muhabbat with the Quran as well. It's not necessarily something. It's not a chore that they have to do. So takeaway message: make sure the whole process of doing Hifz and karawing Hifz is both beneficial to the parent and the student as well. You want it to be an enjoyable process.
So
I'll just make one comment in line with what you're saying. That is exactly what I was thinking about as I was reviewing studies. And I didn't elaborate on that in that last slide because I wanted to, the time is limited. But, control groups are not there. Blinded assessments are not there. And things that, that would make the study design reliable and objective are not there. But why can't we do that? We can. And there are, I think there are enough people that can develop a research methodology in a way that can be objectively done in the right way. So that is entirely something that I particularly would be interested in, involving somebody who is a cognitive neuroscientist, or neurologist, not a pseudo-neurologist like me, but not a neuroendovascular guy, but somebody who does cognitive neuroscience. And I'll volunteer for spreading it and expanding Hamza Bhai's work through whatever channel we want to do it.
Okay, so we're standing between lunch and you folks. But I just want to take 1 second to say that this is exactly the reason we have conferences like this. So there's emerging ideas, there's networking, there's talk, there's motivation, there's inspiration, and we can help each other out. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Lunch is going to be at the golf course. So when you guys exit back to the ballroom, you'll get directions to go to lunch. So please, let's go upstairs and to the left. Let's eat first, and then we'll join again at 1:30 in the ballroom. Thank you.
Sorry, last point ખાલી મોલાની જે ઉમ્મીદ છે કે હર ઘરમાં એક હાફિઝ હોય, ખુદા જલ્દી તમામ કરે અને સગલામાં નસીબ થાય. નમાઝ રૂમ ઇઝ ડાઉનસ્ટેર્સ. એક મરોદો વાસ્તે બી છે, એક બૈરાઓ વાસ્તે બી રાખેલું છે. અને 12:52 12:52 સવાલ થાય છે. નહીં, પોતે પડવાનું, ઇમામતની નમાઝ નથી. They're all